Okay, in previous videos, we have worked with previous values from a row. So let's say we looked at a current row and then compared it to a previous row's value. That's really useful when you're comparing like percent growth or percent decrease or things like that. However, what happens if we don't have a previous value, but we need to look back at a previous value? And what I mean by that is not that we don't have a previous value, but let's suppose our table only has one value. And we want to populate a new value in the table based on that previous value. Well, we can't use a join. That's not going to be part of it, which if you looked at the previous videos, you know that we're using inner joins. Or we could use left joins, technically. But we're trying to populate more data in a table, and we can't use a previous value, so we can't hack it and use a join. And so a couple of weeks ago, I was doing a process on tables where every now and then it would need to look at the previous table that it had done a process on to determine if it was between a certain range, and then if it was, then it would execute a new process on another table. And so it was really complicated and sitting there like, okay, well this is kind of, I'm trying to demonstrate this example for beginning SQL developers, or beginning SQL Server developers, TSQL basically, and so that example is a little too abstract. So I thought about how I could sit there and show how to do this in a simpler process that I think everybody could understand. And so what I want to do today is I'm going to actually use inflation as an example. So right now, for those of you, and I think about half my viewers are not in the United States, which is awesome. So hopefully you understand English. But I believe half of my viewers are foreign. So right now in the United States, they just nominated a new Federal Reserve chairperson. And the Federal Reserve chairperson, Janet Yellen, thinks that inflation is too low. And she thinks that 2% inflation is too low of a target. Okay, so, and again, for most Americans, and if you're a foreigner, this may seem a little crazy, but Americans are really, really bad at math. Most of them are. They really don't know very much about math. This is kind of one of the funny things about them. In fact, Americans specifically, are the only people that I have ever met who think that it is a point of pride to boast about being bad at math. I've never heard a German say they were bad at math and that was cool. Never heard a Chinese person say that, or an Indian person, anything like that. Only Americans would say something like that. Not all Americans, but the majority of them actually do think that being good at math is a bad thing. So, of course, most Americans are like, yeah, Janet Yellen's right, 2% inflation is too low. So today what I want to do is we're going to use that previous process that I was talking about. We're going to look at a previous value and populate a new value based on a previous value, and we're going to use inflation as an example to do that. Whoa, my screen went black. That's what happens when you don't touch it after a while. So first thing I'm going to do is declare a couple of variables, and I'm going to declare the variable of original, if I can spell, and I'm going to do this as a decimal 22 copy this. And then I'm going to declare an inflation variable. And then I'm going to declare a years variable. And this one was going to be a small int. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I'm going to set original, if I could spell again, equal to 100,000. So that's 100,123. And then I want to set inflation equal to, and remember, Janet Yellen thinks that 2% inflation is too high. I'm sorry, it's too low. It actually is too high, and we'll see why mathematically. But she thinks 2% is too low. So we're going to set inflation to be 2%, and then I want to set years equal to 30. Now, note that this is SQL Server 2008 R2. I could, and you've seen this in previous videos, I could easily put this value there. There's a reason why I'm not, and we can play around with stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and set my variables, and I'm going to note that here, play around with variables. Okay. All right, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a table, inflation, and I'm going to create inflation ID, and it's going to be a small int, and it will be an identity 11. And again, if you wonder about these values, where I'm getting this at, like the identity, go and look at previous videos because I discussed them in previous videos as to where I'm getting these. We're trying to automate a lot of this. Did I spell original amount right? Okay. And then we're going to do inflated amount per year. And then finally, we're going to do remaining amount. Just for the record, I'm on a laptop that has a very, very narrow keyboard. Also, the one thing I wanted to note to my viewers, because I know I have now like almost 40 videos, I've noticed that in my videos there is a delay between what I say and what I'm doing on the keyboard. So I think it's like a 2 or 3 second delay, but it's not always the same. Sometimes it's just 1 second. So I'm just letting y'all know that if you say, wait, he was saying this and he was doing this, there may be a delay here. Okay. So now we're going to insert into inflation. We're going to insert into our temp table, and we're only going to insert a couple of values. So we're not going to insert inflation ID, and again, if you've seen previous videos, you know why. That's because in the ID is automatically populated as more values go into it. It's an ID field. Okay, so we're going to insert that. And by the way, when it comes to calculate inflation, one thing I want to say is that there are much, much faster ways to do this than how I'm doing this here. So if you actually are trying to get inflation, don't do this. This is not the method to do. If you're just doing this example because you want to see how you can do other things with like populating something by referring to something previous, this is a good example. But if you're actually looking for inflation, like there's all kinds of algorithms that you can borrow in Excel, Microsoft Excel, and you can do it in Excel, and they're a lot faster than this. But this method does work. Okay. All right, and that's the other thing too I want to declare up here as well. Now that I remember, I want to declare a begin variable, and this will be a default of small int, and it will be 2. And you'll notice that I'm going to put 2 up here, and that's why. And just because I'm kind of picky about organization. Okay. So, all right. Let me see if that's right. Okay. So, we're going to go ahead and we are going to insert these data. Okay. Now, and this is going to populate our value. So this is where I want the developers to pay attention really carefully, because we only have one value in this table. And I'm going to highlight this out and you'll see why later on. I don't want any new value being put into that table. So you'll notice we have an inflation ID of 1, we have an original amount of $100,000, we have an inflated amount per year of $2,000 and $98,000. So if inflation is 2% in 1 year, at the end of the year, from the start of the year to the end of the year, $100,000 becomes $98,000. That's 2% inflation for 1 year, right? So, you know, Janet Yellen's like, man, that's too low. Now some savers might already be kind of disgusted at that, because that's, you know, you've lost $2,000. That in and of itself is a tax. In fact, that's why, for those of you who have heard probably before, they refer to inflation as an invisible tax. Well, there you go, because you just lost 2% of your wealth. Okay, so what we want to do next is we want to figure out how much inflation, what inflation is going to look like, what 2% inflation is going to look like over 30 years. I think I did, yeah. 30 years is what we've set it to, right? So we want to look at what inflation looks like in 30 years, right? What our $100,000 will become. Whoops. Don't want to cancel. Okay. So, but we only have one value in the table, as you just saw. If you look at it, we have one value. So what we have to do logically is we have to use this value, the remaining amount, to populate the original amount on the next. So on year 2, the original amount is going to be $98,000. Then we need the inflated amount, and then the remaining amount is going to be some other value, right? So that's what we're doing logically. Now you can see why I'm referring to, okay, we need to look back at a table, and we don't have the option of a join. So we're not going to be able to use a join, right? Because we don't have the new value. We're going to populate a new value based on a previous value. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a common table expression, and I'm going to call the common table inflation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select inflation ID, and this is key here. And I'm also going to select the remaining amount. Now, if you look at the table below, oops, I'm sorry, remaining amount. That's why you have to be careful about talking while you're typing. If you look at remaining amount, there's only one value right now, correct? And I'm going to select this from inflation. Okay? And here's the whole key part of this algorithm. What we're looking for, because we're going to populate a new value, we're going to populate a new value, inflation ID 2, the original amount has to be this 98,000. So how are we going to look back at that, right? Well, we're going to be looking at inflation ID, which we're looking at inflation ID of 1. Now we know, if we scroll up here, begin is starting at 2. We're going to populate 30 years. So begin is going to start at 2. So this new value is going to be populated at 2. And that's great and that's fine. But we need to look at the previous value. So what we're going to do is we're going to say where inflation ID equals begin minus 1. And again, there's a lot of similarities there to the previous videos if you look at some of my previous videos. And you can see that I'm constantly referring back to something. And that's kind of where you want the inner join, it's, an ID minus 1. Well, that's the same thing here, except now we're looking at begin minus 1, because what's happening here? Let's say the first loop around, right? Begin's going to be 2, which is less than 30. So it's going to select the inflation ID is going to be begin, which would be 2, minus 1, which would be 1. So now we're on this row. That's where this is getting it from. Okay, so now we want to insert into our temp table. And we're going to pull this. Okay, we're going to select those values. Okay. And I'm going to put select here, and then I'm going to do from inflation. And I'm going to call that I. So I'm selecting from our common table expression. Okay, so now I'm going to do I dot, and what's the original amount going to be? The remaining amount, right? So this is going to be row 2. Remember, we're beginning, this is starting at 2 right here. So the original amount in row 2, which is right here, the original amount is going to be the former remaining amount. Okay? All right, so that's the remaining amount because it's at row 1. So it's going to grab that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do the similar thing to the algorithm that we did up here. We're going to try to find how much on the inflated amount per year. So we're going to take I dot remaining amount, and we're going to multiply that times inflation. Okay? All right? And then the next thing we're going to do, is we are going to take the remaining amount, and we are going to subtract that from the basically inflated amount per year. Oh, wait, that won't show up in the video. My bad. Okay. All right. Let's see here. So, let's look at this. All right, so we're on this row, on loop 1, around the loop, right? Okay, so we're on to, so this is going to insert a new value, and it's referring to the previous remaining amount right here. So on loop 3, it's going to be, okay, so this is loop, let's say we're going to go back around on loop 3. So begin's going to equal 3, everything's going to go around. It's going to be 3 minus 1, which is 2. Just going to look back at the second value, which is correct. All right, so what we want to do is we are going to populate this table. It's going to be 30 years, so that's where begin is less than or equal to 30 years. So once it hits 30, it's not going to go to 31. We're going to be starting at 2. We're using an inflation amount of 2%, and of course our original amount is $100,000. And so we want to go ahead and populate this. I'm going to go ahead and delete this or cut that, and we're going to go ahead and populate it. 1 second. All right, and let's look at our inflation here. Okay, push this up so that you guys can see. All right, so again, going back to Jenny Ellen, she said 2% inflation a year is too low. Okay, so what does 2% inflation look like in 30 years? Just 30 years, right? Okay, here's our original amount was $100,000 in year 1. It became $98,000 after year 1. Okay, let's look at year 5. By year 5, the original amount is now $92,000, and by the end of year 5, it's $90,000. So in 5 years, you've already had a 10% tax on your wealth. Over 5 years, you've lost 10%. Remember, this is 2% inflation. This isn't 4, 5, or 6, or 7, or 8%. So at the end of 30 years, $100,000, 2% inflation becomes $54,000. You've lost 46% of your wealth. Now, remember, Janet Yellen said 2% is too low. Let's just assume that in her mind, one second. You'll see why I'm going to do this in a second. Let's just assume in her mind that inflation should be 3%. So this is the reason why I did these sets up here, is that now what we can do is we can play around with our values by we can set inflation to 3%. So let's suppose her target for the Federal Reserve is 3% inflation a year. Since 2% is too low, let's target 3% inflation a year. And if this breaks, it's probably because I didn't drop the table correct or something. Oh, I didn't. Okay, so that's fine. All right, and again, at the end of, notice at the end of year 1, we had originally $100,000. At the end of year 1, $100,000 becomes $97,000. Again, 5. We're starting with $88,529. Our $100,000 after 5 years, starting in year 5, has become $88,529. At the end of year 5, it's $85,873. So in 5 years, we've already lost about $14,000, 14% of our wealth in just 5 years. At the end of year 30, our wealth, $100,000 turned into $40,000. Again, in 30 years, you had a 60% wealth tax assessed. So one of the beautiful things about inflation, and the reason why politicians like it and central banks love it, is you'll notice it's invisible, right? Again, you cannot believe how many comments I've read about this new Federal Reserve chairperson as this is a great thing, 2% inflation is really low, and yeah, we need to raise our inflation targets to 3 and 4%. And again, if we looked at 4%, and we could do that, that was 3%, let's look at 4%. After 30 years, 4% inflation of $100,000 becomes $29,000 after 30 years. You lost over 70%, you lost 71% of your wealth in 30 years. So who do people like Janet Yellen hurt? Now, I'm a young person, and probably some of the people that are watching this are young people. We can adjust, right? Generation Y and millennials, we can adjust. We can snap up and figure it out. In fact, I don't have very much of my savings on the US dollar anyway, and with her becoming Federal Reserve chairperson, it's like bet against the dollar. It's the easiest thing in the world because it's very predictable. But think about someone who's a retiree, and they're relying on fixed income, and their fixed income of bonds is 6% a year. If she targets 3% inflation, they're losing half of their earnings, right? So they're trying to live off of 3%. Imagine retiring and only living off of 3% a year. You have to have an enormous amount of wealth, and then you're always worried about that major expense. Plus, you're older, so you have more medical care anyway expenses. You have all these other expenses that you have to face. I mean, it totally kills you. So inflation ends up hurting savers, it hurts old people, and it really hurts the poor. Because one of the ways that people who are poor can get out of being poor is by saving money and investing it wisely in ways in which they can get good returns. But if you're constantly chewing up their money, the poor people can't escape that prison that they're in. Whereas wealthy individuals have a lot of wealth, they can just move their money around, right? I mean, wealthy individuals can leave the country. Wealthy individuals can they can move their money to other currencies that are not being inflated. And there are currencies out there that are not being inflated, but poor people don't have that option. So the next time you hear someone say, 2% inflation is too low, we do need to raise a target, you can see how much damage just 2% inflation does. And then look at how much 3% inflation and 4% inflation does. Now to the developers, this is pretty awesome. If we look at this while loop, we now have a new tool that we can use if we need to refer to a previous value, insert a new value, or delete a value, let's suppose, without having any type of join. Remember, there is no join here. we're using this loop to refer back to a value to then use as our next value to insert. And you can see we started with a table of one value and we populated 30 values based on that. So these are just some of the tools that we can use. Whether we have that join capability or not, we can still find a way to populate data or refer back to a table or whatnot with these tools.